Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the seventh episode of Truth Island. I'm joined here with Dave, and today we will be talking about whether we believe that humanity has been improving with the passage of time, or is destined to fall victim to the same malevolent forces that we have always succumbed to: war, famine, disease, and perhaps new forms of destruction that remain unknown to us. Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined, puts forth the bold proposition that over time, humans have become far less violent and less likely to kill one another, as the murder rate over time has been decreasing steadily. However, an interesting philosophical question arises from the ashes of his argument. Is it that technology and greater access to resources have made humans far less in need to kill one another? Or has the increase in knowledge and information made us into better and more moral people? To help me work through these and other concerns, I have Dave here to help guide us through the book.
And good afternoon, Aaron. My name is Dave Dittemore. I'm a retired engineer, live in Tacoma, Washington, worked for the phone company back in Kansas for most of my career. I'm a member of Edinburgh Peace, and I'm very flattered that you asked me to talk about this book with you. And I'm not even really sure how I happened onto it. I'm a regular viewer of C-SPAN 2, Book TV, and often when I see an author interviewed that's fascinating to me, I will end up picking up the book at a library or however. And I think that's how I got into this. And of course, with my Veterans for Peace background, it was fascinating to me because we are trying to advocate for reducing wars. And to me, it was quite the tome. It was like, I think, 400 pages, and it took me the better part of a month to work my way through. But it's an interesting argument that war and violence are decreasing because everyone has the concept, and I say that with modern television, they say when it bleeds, it leads. We only see bad news and we think the world's going to pot. So, and someone saying that the world's getting better is quite controversial. But he starts back in prehistory to make his argument and working his way through very analytically, very scientific arguments. And so it's an interesting journey to follow.
Yeah, Dave, I mean, if we're listening to the news right now, we have this idea, and perhaps like every generation feels they've got it the worst. They feel that they're the most dysfunctional generation. They feel like this is the most rebellious times. These are the end times. How does Pinker kind of dispel some of those notions?
Well, it's mainly through his documentation and his scientific study. Yeah, I would say there's so many things like, as a student, I was reading about the Black Plague. Now, with the virus, there's a lot of discussion about the Spanish flu in 1918. And of interest, my parents were both born in 1911, so they would have been young children. So they certainly would have heard about it. But of interest, I saw something about after documentary that no one talked about afterwards. I guess they just didn't want to talk about negative things. These things occur occasionally, and we've had a great civil war, and this, that, and the other. But yeah, he traces our way back, and starting, I'd say it's interesting. The prehistory, you say, well, how could he have statistics on prehistory because there was nothing recorded. But his point is, you dig up 100 skeletons, and if 30 or 40 of them show signs of violence, then that probably is a pretty good reflection of the death rate and due to violence. And he makes a very good point that if you dig up a bone and break it, it breaks like chalk. If you dig up a bone that has rough edges or serrated, or that was broken at the time.
So that would be evidence that someone was hit with a mallet or some kind of a heavy blunt object, and they died as a result of causes that weren't natural.
Yeah, of course, people fall down and break their legs also, but you're right. And and especially, but if it was dug up an area where there were several skeletons, it might have been, a group raid or, a hunting party or one village raiding another village. So yeah, there would be reason to draw conclusions like that. And of course, we've seen pictures of broken skulls and other things like that that are obviously the result of violence.
And the anthropologists and archaeologists that discovered this were convinced that it wasn't just these skulls deteriorating over time. Like there was definitely evidence that it was hit by some kind of object.
Yeah, and as I said, there's maybe variation. It may not have been exactly 30%. It might have been 29%. It might have been 31%. But compared with our loss of life due to violence in the Middle Ages or even now, it shows it was far worse in those early days. Life was rough, as they say.
That's very interesting because, especially now we have all these talks about like like I live in New York and we talk about the murder rate skyrocketing. But it's important to kind of remember that we're not being murdered as high as we were in the past. Like even if the New York City crime rate goes up to where it was in the 70s or 80s, we're still not even coming close to people hitting each other with blunt objects in the Neolithic age.
Yes, and that's an interesting question, Aaron, because I've doing study with a whole bunch of other things I've been involved with. But the interesting fact is the suicide rate is twice the homicide rate. And people just don't realize that because a lot of times suicide is swept under the rug because it's a very embarrassing thing. I have an aunt. Apparently, she was a very beautiful woman and in college age. And my father never talked about it. And I have some cousins in Southern California that talked a little bit about it. But I suspect either she was a lesbian or she was pregnant out of wedlock. Either one were grand embarrassments, and that the only solution she had was to commit suicide, which it's a very sad thing because we're understanding now it's an epidemic in our culture now.
I'm sorry to hear that, Dave. I think that it's interesting that you bring up the suicide rate because we could perhaps argue that our Neolithic ancestors had a much rougher life in terms of their survival. If you didn't find food today, there was no supermarket. You were not living to see tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I think that kind of shows like the power of social stigma and social ties, and perhaps maybe these social influences are more powerful now to the point that they could psychologically influence someone's mind, whereas a Neolithic ancestor probably was not even aware or did not care if they felt embarrassed in the moment. They just were so interested in finding food to survive.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think they were mostly tribal in those days. It might have been, 5 or 10 people living together, but you couldn't have a city back in those days because, so we're just scavenging for food. And so you could only live in small groups. But it's interesting, there's the cultural things that we have, even going back to those days. For example, if I wave to you, it's a sign, see, there's nothing in my hand. I'm not going to attack you. And also the handshake is, I don't have a rock in my hand. If I would, we meet on the path or whatever, if I want to do you, and I might be carrying a rock that would be of a size I could hide it in my palm, but it would be like brass knuckles if I decide to punch you or hit you over the head. So
that kind of reminds me. Now, I've heard this story, and I've spoken to some people who specialize on the Roman Empire. I actually am going to be talking to a Roman Empire expert on Saturday, but I've always heard this story of Roman politicians meeting in these bathhouses and being completely naked and discussing politics and discussing business in there. And they weren't just naked because they enjoyed it. It was actually a way to prove that they weren't concealing a knife or a dagger. Or they were going to be, because like if you're completely naked, you can't be concealing a dagger. Now, I've told people that story and I've gotten mixed feelings. Like, no, that's not true. I'm going to ask my Roman Empire friend on Saturday if that's indeed true. It makes a great story though, right?
And it sounds very reasonable. And the other thing I will say, getting back to the book, which it was very interesting to me, that he spent, I think, most of the first chapter talking about torture. And you might say man's inhumanity to man, but the Iron Maiden, and you've heard the expression drawn and quartered, uh,
Yes.
which, probably great entertainment in those days back before the Roman Colosseum. But this is how we were punishing people. Of course, someone stole something, you cut off their hand. It was a very, very rough life. And so, like I say, I wish he would have condensed that a little bit, but he was, very, very graphic. But
That's also important. I think how we kill somebody is also sort of a test of where we're at as a society, because there are a few states left that have the death penalty, but we have a lethal injection. Like we've, for most part, I think maybe Texas still has the electric chair, and there's only a few people that are grandfathered in to receive that. But I think that if a society takes pleasure in watching
yeah,
that person scream, or like they're completely ripped, and it's a long, painful process, then I think that kind of gives weight to how barbaric a society might be. Whereas if we kind of say, hey, you're a very bad person, we want to be done with you as quickly and as expediently and as painless as possible, I think that kind of speaks to also some type of evolution we're going through.
yeah, I don't know if it would probably a couple hundred years ago, but yeah, we would have public hangings. Of course, you couldn't watch things on TV, so a crowd would gather around, and the horse wrestler or the cattle wrestler would be strung up, and you'd bring your kids and everything else. And yeah, that was just the way things are done.
That's another thing, especially when we talk about lynching and other kind of
Mm.
public spectacle hangings. It was something that we wanted children to see. And that to me almost has we would think of that as almost being demonic today. Like if somebody had to kill someone today, it would be kind of a private affair. It would be done with shame and remorse, and like, hide your children. This is graphic. But the fact that our ancient ancestors made a public spectacle of this, and invited children, like you would take kindergarten. Imagine taking a kindergarten class and watching someone get hung. I'm like, that doesn't even seem human to me anymore.
Yeah, and well, lynching, of course, was to intimidate the blacks. It was probably done in the dark of night, but it was, probably a tree at the edge of town or whatever. So people coming and going would walk by the black man that was hung. In fact, I think it was in Jordan Peterson's that saying that we know what is, very fearful to us, and that's what we use to extract that punishment on others. And we're very, very bad torturers.
It's interesting because we also hear about Vlad the Impaler, Genghis Khan, who also did some very, very, very tough mutilation, boiling people, and all of this very nasty stuff. But each of them not only conquered, but they also broke the golden rule, because I don't think any of those men would have liked to have been tortured in that way. And maybe
Yeah.
maybe you could make the argument, if you have two soldiers in war, well, I'm trying to kill you, you're trying to kill me, but let's just make this as painless as possible for the both of us. I think perhaps maybe, I've obviously never been in war. I've never been a soldier, so it's hard for me to exactly know what is in that mindset. But the fact that our ancestors actively did things onto others and killed them in ways that they would never in a million years want to be killed. I mean, even the mafia, if you think about the way that they may have like beaten or roughed someone up, or threw them to the bottom of some ocean to die. It's just not at all befitting like a worthy adversary, so to speak.
Yeah, that brings something else to me to mind is witches. Because, it was 300, 400 years ago, whatever, they were the terrorists of their time. Because whenever people don't understand what's going on, you have to try to find out what the cause is. And people will think, oh, it's, Widow Jones that lives in the little cabin at the edge of town. My little girl got sick, and she, the day before, she talked to Widow Jones, and she must be a witch. So we get the Dunking School, and dip her in, underwater, and if she rises, she's a witch, and if she doesn't, I forget all the details, but yeah, they would kill innocent people, innocent women, young girls and things, thinking they were making it a better society. And now we look back and say, oh my gosh, but they just didn't understand.
When we enact the death penalty, whether you're for it or
Mm.
against it, the people are typically hardened criminals, and they might be wrongly sitting on death row, but at least if you follow the facts, we would assume that they did something heinous. Like, you can't even get, I think, the death penalty for killing one person. You have to have killed, I think, multiple people.
Mm-hmm.
But our ancestors, if you were just subscribing to a religion that we didn't like, or if you
Yeah.
had some thoughts in your head that the world didn't like, you were tortured and brutally killed. Whereas I think it's an evolution that you can have unfavorable thoughts, but we're not going to brutally kill and torture you.
Yeah, and extermination. Yeah, was it Czechoslovakia when they broke up in different regions? And I think I understand that you're Jewish. Of course, there's the Holocaust that we'll just
Right.
get rid of. We'll just declare these people others, and we'll just get rid of them. Yeah, we've had some terrible history along those lines.
Speaking of the Holocaust, and this is something that maybe we can kind of parse together. So when I think of the Holocaust, I think of something, very efficiently done, something that was extremely heinous, and it almost reminds me of some form of medieval torture, but done in a 20th century lens, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me scratch my head a little bit because it seems like a regression. Like, we had medieval torture, we had things that were, we had the Spanish Inquisition. And then, people still fought one another. We still got in wars, but there wasn't necessarily, and perhaps it's just my gaps in history. Maybe I'm missing something here. But, we had the American Revolution, we had the French Revolution, and that was pretty brutal. But we never had this widespread extermination, after the Middle Ages. And then all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden we hit the Holocaust. So I always wonder, why is it that, we had genocides and terrible things up to the Middle Ages, but then, we kind of have like a period where there are wars, but not genocides. And then all of a sudden the genocide becomes fashionable again in the 20th century.
I think you have to look at a broad scope of, and what my impression is, it really starts with the First World War. That Germany was penalized terribly for starting the war. And so I don't know exactly the background, but I think the German people were starving. And so this leader came along. And in fact, that was one thing I made some notes that wanted to get into Machiavelli. That was his famous book, The Prince. And his advice is you have to start a war and find an enemy to create an other. So I think that was Hitler's idea, that he was, had these huge gatherings and huge speeches and identify the others. And the things are lesser known now, but they're also going after the disabled, the people who are, I guess the polite term is mentally incompetent or whatever. Anyone that wasn't a good white Aryan German boy, we're going to destroy. And it's a terrible thought, but we know now of people whipping up a crowd, and everybody cheering together, where it's for the lynching or to start going after a group of people. It can happen. It's a terrible thought.
Do you think that perhaps that might be a hole in Pinker's philosophy or ideology, that the world is getting better? Because if we have some example of a regression along the timeline, then it's
Mm-hmm.
possible to assume that maybe we'll see another regression, as time moves forward.
Yeah, and that's certainly the thing concerning nuclear weapons. That we have such powerful weapons now, we can wipe out the whole world. Maybe not completely with the bombs, but then there's the radiation for a few million years. So, yeah, that's the thing. We can draw the chart, and the graph goes down gradually. But you're right, there always could be an exception.
nuclear bombs are obviously a horrific thing, but there are, I study political science in graduate school, and there's this theory called MAD, or mutually assured
Yeah.
destruction, which is this idea that if, and this was a Soviet era type thing, like if the Soviet Union did anything to us, we have a secret arsenal of nuclear warheads somewhere, in the Pacific and all around the world, and we would just fire one of these babies off and blow up half their country in instant retaliation, even if DC went under. And this has been thought of as a most beautiful and wonderful thing because of MAD, we can't really have another world war. You can't really use these nuclear bombs because you never know where that secret bomb will go off and blow up half of your country. Now, this kind of goes out the window if we're talking about like a terrorist organization that doesn't have like a home base, and then that's kind of scary because if they launch something, well, where do you retaliate to? If they don't have like a centralized country that they're operating out of. But the thing that leaves me really unsatisfied about MAD is that it doesn't really mean that we as human beings are better people. It just means that the stakes are higher and we have to be careful. And I kind of don't like that. It doesn't, how do you feel about that, Dave?
Well, I guess I was going to say, Aaron, this brings me back to my youth because that's the era I grew up in. You've probably seen the pictures of ducking cover. That if there's nuclear war, we're going to get under our elementary school desks. Yeah, that's going to help in a nuclear war. But it was the interesting thing because, of course, our Soviets were our ally in World War II against fascist Germany, but we very much looked down our noses. But and I'm very much a student of Truman and Eisenhower, but we knew that we had to work with these people. So we started talks, and so at least the Soviets were reasonable enough to realize that, because I think they said if it was 75 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, after you launch your missile, they're going to be delivered to the other country. So, we just can't have this exchange happen. In fact, I worked for the phone company, and we're very proud that we put in the hotline, which I guess was really a couple teletypes back in the old day, to start communication between the Soviets and ourselves to prevent that. But as you're right, we got some terrorist organization now that's going to do it. Yeah, because we have good examples of people sacrificing themselves for some cause. So yeah, it's the world's in that way is a very dangerous place now. Although I know they've made attempts to try to bring in some of these old nuclear weapons and disable them. But yeah, it's a scary thought.
Let me ask you this question, Dave. Suppose nuclear weapons were never invented. We just never we never invented them at all. Einstein didn't lend any theories or any math to make that happen. Would we be just as vicious as we've always been? So I'm wondering, and let's just say everything else remained the same. The technology, the information, the internet, everything else is the same. We just don't have nuclear warheads. Would we really be these awesome angels that don't engage in world wars, or do you think world wars would be back on the table?
Well, that's the thing. We continually advance our technology to get more efficient at killing people. But it was the bow and arrow for a while, and you'd have hundreds of archers shooting arrows at the other side, and then muskets and rifles, and then the cannon comes along, can do terrible damage to knock down buildings, and of course, well, before the cannon was the catapult. But so no, and that's the sad thing is that we always reward these poor engineers that come up with these tools of war. But it just seemed like that we've have come to like the end. That and of course the sad thing is like just traditional bombs. In fact, that's a lesser known fact that firebombing in World War II was so unethical, but it was an attempt to scare the people into submission. But we killed more people in Dresden in a firebombing than we killed with a nuclear weapon in Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Wow.
So yeah.
That I did
And
not know. I did not know that. Wow.
and the thing is, and Dresden wasn't even a military target. It was a cultural center. There are universities there, and I don't know, academies of music and all that kind of stuff. They were just to kill civilians and just to rain terror. Yeah.
So it's almost as if, like, if we didn't have these things, the killing would still occur. We'd still find different ways of killing each other without the nuclear bombs, and perhaps maybe even those ways would be more like messier, even, like, because they're so, like, a firebomb, I imagine, is just this chaotic spiral of fire, and that seems
Oh,
really, really unpleasant. Now, I'm sure being hit with a nuclear warhead isn't exactly a walk through the park either, but I could imagine that, like, the more, like, the less precise the instrument, the more brutal the death.
yeah. And that brings back to my mind, we had a thing called the neutron bomb for a while. And of course, this is probably 40, 50 years ago. But because it was neutrons, there was no radiation. So it would destroy the buildings, but not the people. So that was, I think, somebody's idea for a while. But since as I say, you may not even heard of it. It's gone away. It's not talked about anymore. But they've always had ideas to talk about like that.
Hopefully they're not bringing that back, right?
Yeah.
let's not
Well,
let's not give anyone any ideas about, like, hey, let's bring back the neutron bomb. And
and I had one comment to make about the death penalty,
sure.
because to me it's revenge. Because I mean, there's been studies that prove it doesn't prevent anyone, because typically rational people aren't murderers. But I have a favorite radio host that was pro death penalty or whatever, and a couple times I tried to call him, because my thought is, like, for example, Timothy McVeigh blew up this building in Oklahoma City and killed thousands of people.
Yeah.
And my thought was, wouldn't you like to interview Timothy McVeigh like 20 or 30 years later? Because then at that time, he might be honest about, in fact, this book, I forget the name of the book, was found on the front seat of his car about conservative revolution and things. But so, yeah, wouldn't you like to know, was he really influenced by that? Was he attempting to start an armed revolution? But we want to kill somebody. By God, we want to kill them right away. We don't, although now in most civil cases, they go on forever and ever in appeal. But the thing about the our spy that's over in Moscow now, the young guy that is considered computer wizard.
Oh, Snowden.
Yeah, Edward Snowden. To me, I've heard him interviewed a couple of times. See, a brilliant guy, and he took the lid off a terrible problem in our society. But by God, let's kill the guy. And to me, it's as much to silence him as anything else, because a lot of these people could tell stories.
But yes, going back to the Timothy McVeigh thing, and Charles Mason, for example, and he lived a very full life in jail, but he doesn't seem to have changed at all. Like, he still thinks he's some kind of pseudo god, and wonder if leaving these serial killers alive for 30 years, like, do they change, or do they just keep regurgitating the same stories about themselves?
Yeah, and and I can't really claim much, but I just thought that might be an opportunity, because while he's at trial, he's just defending himself, and he's not going to admit anything. But after a while, I just thought there might be a possibility. Because, well, like, who was the professor was up in the woods in Idaho or something like that, was sending letter bombs to people.
Oh, the Unabomber?
But obviously an educated guy,
Yeah.
and I think it was his brother or sister, somebody recognized his prose and said, I think it might be this guy that's kind of disturbed or whatever. But yeah, that's a sad thing in our society. We have these disturbed people hanging around, and we don't have a really good way to find them.
Maybe, I like what you said, that everyone on their trial, innocent or guilty, wants to get out of jail. And I think that's I think
Sure.
that's a very true thing about human nature. You could be a saint, but with the prospect of life in prison, you're going to do everything to kind of get out of that. And maybe being in jail, like, once you have life and there's no parole, and that is basically going to be the end of it, then at that point, maybe you can break down and cry and apologize and be sorry, because you know that whether you're sorry or not sorry, your situation isn't going to change. It's not going to affect you. You have no stake in the game anymore because you're not leaving jail no matter what you do. So thinking about, Dave, about like the human element and the human capacity to change our hearts, because like looking outside, like, oh my God, this nuclear warhead, or being on death row, and then some kind of external thing. That there is an example from Pinker's book about the printing press that you want to share.
Yes, Aaron. One of the things that really got to me in the fascination, of course, we've all always heard the story of Gutenberg and the printing press, and of course, being a good Christian, he started, pushing Bibles, and because before that, when books were handwritten, they were very, very rare. So he started, printing Bibles and Bibles and Bibles. He thought, wow, and it was interesting. About that same time, violence was decreasing. But the interesting thing, according to Pinker, was it wasn't really that century, it was the next century.
Hmm.
And at that point, they were starting to push out what I call dime store romance novels. Of course, that was the economy now. I guess you call it a dollar store romance novels. But just the plain everyday fiction stories of normal people in their everyday lives. And his theory is that where the Bible is good as far as morality and religion, all this idealism, but when you start reading about other people, wow, they've got a life just like me. So when we raid the village, maybe we shouldn't put the heads of all the men on stakes on the outside of the village. Maybe we can overtake the village, but not be so violent about it.
Now that story actually gives me hope. And the reason it does is that with the nuclear bombs sort of making us less violent, that's out of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that through knowledge and through some kind of like reading and then some kind of conversation about morality and justice and humanity, that's actually what can lead to the most change, is when we have conversations and we think about, like, we reflect. And I think those dime store books actually cause people to have that pause and be like, wait a minute, like, there's got to be a better way to do this, or like, I wouldn't want this done to me. And so I think that, like, we need more of that.
One other observation, that war is seductive. It's so tempting. As I said, I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, and we have a convention every year. And a few years ago, we had a convention, and they were talking about this Freedom Brigade that went over to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And I think it was like school teachers from New York and some labor organizers or whatever. And they're over there fighting the fascists and all this good stuff. And you're saying, well, come on, Roosevelt, send them some weapons. Come on, send them some guns. And I realized, now wait a minute. I'm in the Veterans for Peace convention, and I'm trying to talk somebody to send war materials to kill people. So as I said, it's just so seductive and so tempting to get your way with somebody, to shake them, or to hit your wife, or to beat up your neighbor. We have just been brought up this culture that's the way to get your way, and that's what we have to unlearn.
I'd like to learn more about Veterans for Peace in many ways. A lot of people, and I'm actually guilty of making this argument myself, and maybe you have a better answer. I always say, well, like Albert Einstein was a huge peace advocate. He believed peace
Mm-hmm.
at all cost. And then Hitler came along and he fled the country and was like, okay, I can see that there are exceptions. Like like we can't always have peace. So what do you say as a veteran for peace? What do you say in the Hitler scenario where it's like, okay, nothing we do works here?
Boy, Aaron, that's a $10 million question right there. In fact, I have some veterans friends who are on the conservative side, and they asked me that question. Yeah, because it's a simplistic answer to say no, no wars, no hitting, no violence. But you're right. It was a situation, um, and it had to be done. This man had to be stopped. But it is interesting though, because I've argued with people about, well, we had the American Civil War and we had to break free from Britain, so we had to have a war against them, didn't we? He said, well, actually, over in India there was this guy called Gandhi, And even though some people got hurt, he had a nonviolent revolution against Britain, and India broke free from Britain without war. Oh, yeah, I guess so. And one of my friends that was our chapter president for a while brought forth a good series, but Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was advocating for radical change in our country to do it nonviolently. They talked about, I think, some Scandinavian countries that was had passive resistance against the Germans in World War II. But we advocate for resolving disputes without war and violence. But yeah, it's a difficult question sometimes.
Yeah, it is. I've been in discussions with people and I use Gandhi all the time of like, aha. And then I think I have these debates and I don't have the answer if the Jews would have tried a nonviolent thing, would that have like changed his mind? And I'm going to say no, it would not have worked. He would have gone about his genocidal business without a care in the world. But I think that before Gandhi, I'm really trying to think of nonviolent protests before. And I think that the fact that the nonviolent protest is a birth child of the 20th century might show us that we are evolving, because and again, I'm sure there probably was a nonviolent protest of sorts before Gandhi, but I can't really recall it being as powerful and provocative up until that point. And the fact that you have MLK that emulates it, several decades later, and and there's other movements now that kind of have nonviolent tactics and passive resistance. It kind of shows us that our means of disagreeing with another has evolved, especially in the 20th century.
We're trying, there was a feminist leader, and I think it may have been Harriet Beecher Stowe, but another famous lady in that period. And I forget now if it was after the Civil War or World War I, and it was her Mother's Day message. And it was a definite anti-war message that the mothers of the world will no longer let their sons go off to kill the sons of other mothers. It's a very powerful statement, but it's not very well known anymore. But people have made this attempt from time to time. And I forget who was the British leader that flew over and attempted to appease Hitler to prevent the war, but unsuccessfully, obviously. But yeah.
Do you know, here's a fun fact. Did you know that Gandhi wrote a letter to Hitler?
Wow.
And he actually did. And I don't think Gandhi was, I think, being held by the British at the time. And I don't even think the British let the letter release. But Gandhi actually writes, my friend,
Wow.
he actually talks to Hitler as if I don't think he knew that much about what he was doing, but he writes something along the lines of, my friend, I see what you're doing in Germany, and there's a better way of doing it. Try nonviolence and so forth. And who knows, if that letter had actually arrived at Hitler's desk, I wonder if some correspondence would have started. It's one of these things in history that we'll never know.
Well, and the other interesting thing is a lot of Hitler's idea came from the United States of our white supremacy and was it eugenics or whatever, the racial separations. Oh, and the other thing, and that Gandhi, I think, had been an officer in the British military, which was kind of interesting.
And a lawyer, yeah, he had he was definitely, his career path was going in one direction, and then he just took a radical turn.
Yeah.
So getting back to the Pinker thesis, it's like, why, we do have the Holocaust, we do have things that kind of contradict it, but I would be hard pressed to disagree with his conclusions, and like I do see the argument that the nuclear warheads are peace out of necessity, not out of love and kindness. But the fact that even when we have the rioting, as it is called today, I think it's far more tame and just like of I mean, there is violence. I can't say there isn't, but I think that the way that we're protesting and the way that we're interacting with one another has evolved considerably from where we came from.
Yeah, that brings up another important point from Pinker, is that having the authority figure, the police in the city, the sheriff in the rural area, the highway patrol in the highways, that is the greatest reduction in crime and violence. And the very troubling thing now, okay, we've had some police officers that are doing bad things, they're making mistakes, they're abusing their power, and they're obviously abusing blacks and other people of color. But the answer is not to do away with the police. And I'm close to Portland, and that's been going on, I guess, for 100 days now or whatever. And it's a, a to me a misinformed conclusion that because we've had some defective police officers, we have to do away with the police. Um, Although our culture is now fairly peaceful, but we still have to have an authority figure.
So maybe we're not at such an evolved state that we can have no police at all, but perhaps the next state is, how do we have more peaceful interaction between police and citizens? Like I think that would be like the next layer to kind of fix, of like how do we get that like evolved relationship in place, because we're definitely not at the level where we don't have anyone in charge and we all just keep our doors unlocked and trust one another. I wish we could get to that level, but
Yeah.
I think that's like the next step. And like I think if you follow Pinker, his evolution of our nature is over the course of 10,000 years. And
Yeah.
I sometimes think that we want to jump the gun. We want to get all the way to the utopia of no police, we all are hugging and kissing each other and perfect harmony. But we don't appreciate that our evolution and our better nature, if you would, takes 10,000 years. It's taken a long time for us to get here.
Yeah, and the other sad thing right now is we do a lot of our treatment of especially the mentally ill, but also of addictions. We throw everybody in prison or jail. And I think I've heard the figure about 30% of our jail population are actually mentally ill. And it would actually be far cheaper to give them a good mental illness treatment or a drug addiction withdrawal policy or whatever. But we are so addicted to simple solutions.
And that kind of comes back to like the Genghis Khan, like do unto others as you want done to you. Like Genghis Khan did not care. He tortured people in ways I'm sure he would not want to be tortured. But if we ask ourselves, if I was addicted to heroin or some pernicious drug, would I want the book thrown at me? Would I like am I not deserving of help and rehabilitation? That there might still need to be some sort of punitive consequence for that behavior, but to say that that person's not deserving of some rehabilitation so that they can get off something they can't very well control, I think kind of violates the golden rule.
Well, and that's the problem in our society. It's the opioids, which isn't the illegal heroin. It's the pain pills that somebody may have been in an automobile accident or broke their leg or whatever, and they need to have pain pills. But the prescriptions are not controlled, and sometimes you can go to another doctor and get some more, so you may be overdosing, and so it's very easy to get into a habit, and so people are addicted. But you're right. We need to, because to me, they can be productive members of society in most cases, but we need to give them treatment and not just say, well, you're just a bad person, so we're going to lock you up. So that's my viewpoint anyway.
Well, Dave, I really like our conversation, and I think that I think it's nice talking with you, and I think we can both reflect that we've come a long way. And just because we've come a long way doesn't mean that we're done progressing. Like I think we still need to progress and get better. But sometimes it's nice to just sit and at least be like, hey, we're not clubbing each other to death as much as we used to.
Yes, and I realize in our conversations on the 52 Living Ideas that you brought up the idea of asking questions. So I knew if I talked to you, you'd ask me questions. But to me,
We didn't club each other to death in this interview.
Not quite. But yeah, it made a small step toward a better world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you, Aaron.
And with that, we conclude our 7th episode of the Truth Island podcast. Please join us next time.